Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to D&I One-on-One. This is a monthly webinar series where we talk about different topics related to culture, inclusivity, diversity, belongingness, all that good stuff. So today's conversation is about understanding the complexities of identity, which is crucial for fostering inclusivity because too often we see each other through the lens of one or two dimensions of diversity. So when you think of Pride Month, for example, it's June, well, we're still in Pride Month. A lot of people only think gay and lesbian instead of thinking about the full spectrum of identities. But as the saying goes, there's more to us than meets the eye. My name is Jina Etienne. I'm creator and host of the series. I'm a certified diversity executive, and my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. I create trainings and workshops and facilitate conversations and programs focused on helping participants connect mindfulness and awareness to their daily actions and words to help foster an environment that is inclusive, the outcome of which is belonging. Joining me today is Stacey Gordon, founder and principal consultant of Rework Work. She's author of Unbiased, Addressing Unconscious Bias at Work, and she created the course Addressing Unconscious Bias on LinkedIn Learning, one of their most popular courses. She describes her culture as a mix of proper Londoner with street smart New Yorker with some Caribbean and South American thrown in for fun. And that is what sets her apart. She's a globally recognized keynote speaker, leadership consultant, DEI strategist focused on reworking how companies work. Stacey, thank you for joining me this month.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So what I want to start with is I want to go back to a word that you used in a conversation. You used layers, and I love that word. And we were talking about the challenge of inclusion because it's used broadly and generically, and rather than focusing on one aspect of a person's identity or so-called labels that we default to in this work, you were talking about looking at it a lot as layers. So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. When it comes to thinking about how we're looked at, right? Like we have these labels. Today we're talking about the fact that we are more than our labels, but there's layers to us. And I use, content around the identity wheel, which many people have probably seen, but there's all these different ways of looking at how our identities are categorized. Like you may have seen a tree, right, with roots underneath, or you might have seen an iceberg with, some on top and a lot underneath. But I use this identity wheel because it is really simple. And what I love about it is that the center circle is what we typically see, right? That's what's more visible. Like when I showed up today on camera, you can see and at least make some assumptions that I am Black and that I am female. You really can't look at me though and know particularly what my cultural background is or what my familial status is, right? You don't know if I have siblings. You don't know if I'm a parent or, an uncle, aunt, but could be an uncle.
Could be an uncle. Yep.
Be an uncle. So you just don't know. And I think that what happens with us is we fixate in this center. And we forget that there are layers to us. We have these layers. There's more to us than meets the eye. And I'm a big fan of telling people to remember that people are more than their center circle, right? They're more than their race, their gender, their physical and mental ability. And again, we make a lot of assumptions even about these things. Even though they're typically more visible, they're still not actually 100% visible, right?
Right. And what's interesting is because when you say that, I think when we see somebody for the first time, I think it's something like 1/100th of a second for us to make an assumption about somebody's identity. And we only see the visuals, and a lot of times we're wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And it sticks. That's the other thing is it sticks and it's so hard to change it. And there's actually this really funny example. This happened a couple of years ago and I use it in some of my presentations. I have the screenshots from it because I was on LinkedIn. And the only reason I even know this happened is because somebody tagged me in it, right? It's like two people are fighting and it's like, Mom, they're like tagging me in the middle of this thing that's happening. So these two individuals are having this conversation about a post, and somebody had posted a picture of their son, but his hair was braided and it was really long and it was down his back. So he was talking about their Native American heritage and how his son gets picked on sometimes for his long hair. And all of the comments were, oh, God bless her. Her hair is so beautiful. I love her hair. And he's like, I said, son, this is a boy, right? But everyone just saw the braid.
Yep.
And all they kept saying was she, her, love her hair. And he was like, for the love of God, what is it going to take for you to, like, they don't read, but it's like, we don't focus in. As soon as we get that visual, right, that center circle visual, we saw hair, we absolutely applied a label of female to it. And God forbid we have to get taken out of that, right? It is really hard to now work ourselves out of this context that we have provided for ourselves. That is false.
Yeah, and it works a couple of different ways. So in the workplace, for example, you have a new hire, it's their first day, and you're the one who's going to be their greeter, their welcomer, their buddy. And so what if it was, I'm imagining that situation, and somebody walks in and they see this person with long hair with braids and go, she, in their mind, and then it sticks. And so now they're taking their colleague around and introducing him to their colleagues, but saying her. And it's going to take a while to unravel that. It's amazing how, like you said, how easily that sticks. The other aspect of this is when we talk about a diverse workplace, people are walking in and that first impression, those labels, I see you, I see Black woman. And as a result, my brain is starting to process all of the things that are the shoulds for how you're supposed to show up, the things I expect you to do, the way I expect you to behave, because it helps me understand this environment, but it also means I'm putting you into a box, and it might not necessarily be a reflection of who you are.
Absolutely. And so many things, right? Like how like what I might eat, what I might say, how I might speak, what I might wear, how I might perform on the job, especially. And that's a big one because we don't realize how those things are intertwined. But there are so many times when I work with a company and what I ask them to do is look at what percentage of their employee base are on performance improvement plans. And out of those, what percentage of them are employees of color? And it's usually a very high percentage relative to the actual number of employees of color that they have. And why is that? Because we have expectations of how a person is going to perform. And so even when they're performing well, if we have an expectation that they're not going to perform well, we still see them as an underachiever, as a low performer, even when they're doing their best work.
All right. So I was trying to remember the term for the person who's going to argue the other direction. There's a term for that.
Yes. And I'm trying to not say devil's advocate because that's not right, but it's
but that's the one. That's the one I was thinking of. So that's not right.
Yes.
Anyway.
But there is it is right, but there is a more politically correct way to say it. And I shouldn't even say politically correct, but just there's a better way to say it. And I'm forgetting what it is right now too.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge, we're talking about labels. We want to acknowledge that our language can sometimes, it needs to be updated. So, but what I was thinking about when you were saying that is the backlash, the DEI backlash. There's been a growing dialogue and recently more headlines around that. And so what would you say then to the person who says, well, but couldn't it be that race has nothing to do with that proportion of employees that show up on those performance improvement plans? Or are you making assumptions and labeling people? So from the other perspective, how do you address that?
Well, just with data, right? Even if you just look at it from a pure statistical number, how is it that you only have 6% of, and I'll just use Black employees, right? But yet 20% of them are represented in performance improvement plans. Statistically, that means it's not really possible without there being some bias in there, right?
Right.
So unless you then actually agree that somehow all Black people are low performers, right? You would have to actually make that assumption in order to agree with that data.
Yeah, that one's like, now that you say it that way, yeah, that's a problem. Well, here's what I want to do. I want to go to our first polling question because I want us to shift our conversation since it's Pride Month and talk a little bit about gender. So, Jasmine, can we launch that poll?
And we've got that first poll open for you all right now. And if this is your first time with us, you'll respond to this poll by clicking the radio button to the left of your answer choice. And be sure to click submit. You've got those options on screen. I'll leave this open to allow everyone to get their responses recorded.
So we're going to talk a little bit about Pride Month invites labeling, right? There are so many terms, there's so much language, not necessarily language we all know or are comfortable with. Gender identity is one of those. We'll throw out the definition in a second. Just want to see how people respond.
Yeah, so we've got about half of our audience saying never, about 46%. We've got 20% saying before college, about 15% prefer not to answer, 12% somewhere in between, and then 10% recently within the last 5 years.
That's a wide range. Almost half right now, it's at 46% say never. Does that surprise you at all, Stacey?
It doesn't, because the first thing I thought about, and so I do think about data a lot, right? The first thing I thought was, I wonder what percentage of male and female, I'm just using a binary here for a moment, but right, I thought about what percentage of male and female are on this webinar today, because then my brain goes to, let's assume that it's 50-50 men and women, right? Mm-hmm. Then I'm thinking, okay, so that means that that number would be a little skewed, I would think, in my head, because my bias and my assumption based on experience is that more men than women have never thought about their gender identity, right? And so anyone who is queer has probably always thought about their gender identity. So that's how I look at things. It's like, how do you reflect that data to the actual gender data, which would then do we have a real correlation there? And that's what I would look at. So that's where my brain immediately went.
What I think is interesting is that, so DEI work has been done for 40 years. This work isn't new. There's an entire body of work that dates back into the 60s, and some of it is even earlier than that. But for many people today, this feels new because, especially as a result of COVID, with all of us sort of hunkering down in our homes and everything that was happening out in the world amplified. And then there was this entire flood of conversation and a wave of racial reckoning. I can't come up with the word. Yes. And then there were talks about all the different identities, right? So we see all of these conversations, and part of that were terms like the ones you have on the screen here: gender expression, gender identity. I have to tell you that myself, I would say, my answer would be, in the last 5 years, did I label it? I think there's a difference between becoming aware that I'm a woman. I knew that all along. I knew being a woman was not the same as being a man. There were different rules that applied to me, or at least I made that assumption. But I didn't label my identity as a woman. So what do you say to people who, there's the difference between my identity and how I label myself?
But I think that it depends, right? There's context to it. And can I just say, not to call you out, right? But like, I can tell you must be a Gen Xer because you said the 60s was 40 years ago. And can I just say, it's actually like 60 years ago now, right?
Was it? Oh, for crying.
I know, but there's a whole thing going around. Like, as you get older, we still keep thinking like the 60s are only 40 years ago. And it's like, no, it's longer than that.
I was doing that in honor of the Gen Xers.
But I think when, like for me, personally, because I can only really speak for myself, right? I can't speak for anybody else. I do label myself as a woman. Why? Because there are so many things that remind me that I'm a woman, right? There are for the fact that I have children. When I go into a hospital or the doctor and I ask certain questions, there are things that doctors still can't explain to me. Don't get me started on menopause, okay? And so these kinds of things constantly remind me that I'm a woman, because I'm constantly saying to myself, if I were a man, I wouldn't have to deal with this nonsense. If I were a man, you wouldn't ask me that question. If I were a man, you wouldn't treat me this way. Right? So I do think of my identity in terms of being a woman, just because of the way that that identity is reflected back to me and how I work.
So when you say it that way, that absolutely makes sense. And I want to jump over to this slide around words matter, because as I think about the language that we're talking about, I agree with everything you said. I will also add that I don't know that I've labeled myself, as opposed to understanding everything that you said makes sense. But I start to think about labels, labeling myself. Gender is one thing, but then look at all these other terms here that people will use. And this is the way we tag people. And we often say, you are X. So a person is disabled, a person is Black, a person is male. We don't necessarily see a disabled Black male or a person with a disability. Um, and then there's so much more to it. And some of these words aren't very kind. But lazy is something that is often thought about millennials, for example.
Right.
So,
Absolutely. And when we think about, so a lot of times when we label, we do go to the negative. Because if you look at a lot of these words on here, many of them, especially the big ones, are negative, right? Like I'm just kind of scanning the big ones on here, and I'm thinking, well, the only ones that don't seem to be negative are disabled and Gen X, because disabled is a fact, right? But I know some people do think of that as a negative. But I'm literally scanning and I'm like, okay, but I don't.
Right? To be fair, I created this cloud to try to pull up a lot of the stereotypes and the labels that we use. And my thought was, and I'd love it, folks, drop it in the chat, or actually you don't chat, Q&A. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Oftentimes you look at a word and there's an instant association with what the image is behind that word.
Right.
And the challenge then is that when a person syncs up with that image, that person is that thing.
Right.
And that's where we start to have some of these challenges. And I was going to say we bucketize people. But we put people in a bucket, and then when they behave in a way that is inconsistent with that, it's not always perceived as positive. It sometimes is a compliment can be made, and that is a compliment's actually a bit of an offensive statement, right? Somebody meant well by it, but it kind of stung or it kind of hurt.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. I'm just looking at a few of the comments that have come in, and I see that someone said, how about just calling ourselves fellow human beings? I would love that. That would be wonderful. That's what we're working towards. But we're not there because people aren't doing that, right? So I would love us to just think about ourselves as fellow human beings. But that's not really been happening, right? At least it happens for some people, but not for everyone. And again, if we go back to that identity wheel, like there's certain places, or even just here in these labels, there's certain places where it's going to be different for different people. And so if you've never really thought about what it might be like for somebody else, I think that's something we need to think about is, what is the perspective of somebody else when I use that label? So for example, someone else sitting here says, I'm a workaholic boomer and I'm proud of it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so workaholic and boomer, right? You might be proud of it. You might think it's funny to say that. But if I walked up to you and called you that, you probably wouldn't like it very much, right? Mm-hmm. We also have to remember that labels are sometimes personal to us, and we can use them to label ourselves. But how do we feel if somebody else labels us in that way? And especially when they do it with a derisive tone, right? Yeah. Or in a way that is not positive. Because you know what? I love the fact that I'm Black and a woman. But I'll tell you right now, people have used those words in some not very nice ways, right?
Yeah, so that is the thing. That's language is complicated. It's nuanced. There is a really good rule that many of us, if we can follow this rule in the workplace, especially when we might stumble and bump into each other, as a starting point. When those oopsie moments happen, if somebody says something to me, I want to extend the I want to honor that they had good intention. I'm going to give them the good intention. And what I would ask for them to do is acknowledge that this stung, that I took offense, that I found this upsetting, that hurt. And then if we can both acknowledge that, I'm going to acknowledge your good intention. You'll acknowledge that maybe what you did hurt a little bit. We can stay present in that moment and work through it. Otherwise, you're throwing a label at me. I'm going to cross my arms and then that's it. I've got the wall up and we're not having any conversation. This is not inclusion.
Right.
And this is true whether it's two white men, right?
Right.
The same dynamic, it's a human dynamic that we have to acknowledge, but is more complicated across difference.
Right. And understanding. So I had this conversation literally, probably was this week. I don't even know what day it is. It's Friday. Okay. So it was earlier this week. I was on vacation and I was talking to somebody. I won't even get into how we got there, but the comment was that I really want, what he said to me was, I don't like the fact that one set of ideals is somehow right and another set of ideals is wrong. And he was like, I really think that we should be in this place where both can kind of coexist and we can acknowledge that each person, maybe has a different perspective. And I said, yes. And we do have to also remember, though, there are times when that perspective is wrong, right? We have to acknowledge that there are some perspectives that, yes, not correct. And so what you're saying, I think, is that there's this place where we're going to start to have the conversation, and then there needs to be some growth. There needs to be an acknowledgement that I hear you, I hear what you're saying, I hear where you're coming from, and there's maybe more to it. Maybe you don't have all the information. Maybe you haven't thought about the other perspective. Right. And not to say that you're then going to hear all of that and immediately change your mind, but I think we have to get to a point of at least being open to hearing what other people have to say. Because there's a comment in there, someone said, people wonder why I don't talk, right? Because all of this stuff that's happening. Mm-hmm. And I don't think, I counsel people all the time. It's like, this isn't the time to shut down and say, well, this is too hard. I'm just not going to talk about it, right? I'm just going to not say anything. This is where we actually have to lean in, but we have to lean in a way that shows that we are educated. Because what frustrates most people isn't that you said something wrong. It's that you said something wrong and don't care. So we really need that space to have the conversations and discuss like why I might think your perspective is the way that it is. And you can tell me about that and we can have a conversation about it. And then, yeah, we can go on our merry way. But at the end of the day, there has to be some acknowledgement that, yeah, you know what, you might have a point here.
Yeah. And I think even the person who felt aggrieved or hurt, sometimes, I know this has happened to me, I might have taken something actually the wrong way. And in staying present for me in that dialogue, rather than writing them off, show me the hand kind of thing, I come to understand their perspective and I can understand the why. And I can see now how I heard it differently because of my filters, because of my defenses, because of the chip on my shoulder. So this isn't just a you thing. Most of this work lives squarely within me, my space. But it's about respecting each other's spaces.
Yeah.
I also want to add to that, you said, and people wonder why I don't talk. I think the other thing is important to recognize that we want all voices in this conversation. Not just the women or not just the minorities or people of color, but all voices in the room. That's how we can round out and fill out this conversation and dialogue.
Yeah. And I think because people then wonder, well, why do we even need to like, why do we care that, Joe is attracted to John? We're just coming to work. I don't need to know that information. But I'll tell you why it matters, because we have different perspectives, and we already know that when you have diversity in the workplace, you're going to have workplaces that are more productive and that are more effective. And so the interesting thing is, there's this example from Hallmark. Many years ago, I was at a conference, and they were talking about this through their ERG program, Employee Resource Groups. And one of the things that they did was they actually turned around one of their stores. So, you go into the pharmacies, Dwayne Reed, depending upon where you are, right? Or
Isn't that New York?
Right? I used to be in New York.
Right, New Yorker. Got it.
Yeah. So like CVS or whatever your pharmacy is, right? And they have the card section. And I mean, you go in now, they're like $7 a card, which is ridiculous, by the way. But you go in and you get a card. And so they had this one location where their cards were not performing. And the pharmacy said to Hallmark, we're going to just rip this out. Like, we're about to take all these cards out. And they were like, wait. Before you do that, give us a little time to see if we can turn it around. So what they did is they actually went to their employee resource group that catered to LGBTQ employees. And they went in and took a look. Why did they go to them? Because they did demographics. I said I like to look at data. They did demographic search, and they noticed that most of the people in that region, in that community, were queer. So they said, okay. They sent out their ERG groups to go look at the cards and just go see what's happening. They came back and said, we know what your problem is. All they had was binaries, right? To my husband, to my wife. There were all these cards that most queer people wouldn't use. So they went back and redesigned all the cards. And now they had so much more inclusive language. That store, that location, ended up being one of their most profitable.
Well, I want you to know that you just gave away, possibly, I'm going to go to this polling question now that you've answered it. So everybody gets a free answer. Jasmine, can we launch that second poll?
You're welcome, everyone. You're welcome. Just put a thank you in the chat.
All right, we've got that next poll open for everyone right now. Go ahead and give us your thoughts.
And I'll add, is it acceptable for you to use? That's the question, right?
We're changing it on the fly. I like it. Well, and it's interesting because the queer is a word, is an example of a word that the LGBTQ community has reclaimed it. But does that mean I can say it? Right. And I think that's the core question here. There are lots of words. You mentioned this earlier. There's some labels. I'm going to throw them on myself. Maybe humor, maybe defensiveness, whatever the case may be. You can't say it, but I can.
Yeah.
That's where this starts to get even more complicated. All right, let me go look at the polls. I think I know how to do this. Polls open. It doesn't seem to be open. I'm not seeing responses. How do I see that, Jasmine?
There's a little bit of a delay, Jina. I can see like 42% have said yes. Or is it populating for you now?
It is. It is
Okay.
now. Yeah. Can you see the results, Stacey?
I cannot.
Okay, good. Then can you take a guess? Where do you think, how many people do you think are saying yes as a percentage? What was your guess?
40%.
Oh, you cheat. It's 42%. And 21% said not sure. I will tell you that before I started doing this work full time, I'm going to go back to like probably about 2017, 2018, I would have been in the I'm not sure or no category because queer was a slur. That was my understanding of the word and was not a word we should be using.
Yeah. I think Peter has it right. He said, queer is only acceptable to use based on the context it's being used in. If it's directed at someone with malice, it isn't acceptable. And that is really how I look at it, especially because I do have many friends who are in the LGBTQ spectrum. But again, this goes back to labels. I use queer because I don't want to say LGBTQIA because on top of that, depending upon who my audience is, in Europe, they use a slightly different LGBTQ. I think it's LGBTQI. And then like there's all these differences, right? And so for me to have to sit here and go, okay, wait, which one do you use? Do you put in the 2 eyes or the 1 eye or the I don't know? And then if I'm being fully inclusive, I will say queer because I just mean anybody who isn't straight, right? I don't care what you label yourself as. You're in the bucket, right? But if I'm specifically talking about lesbian, then I'm going to say lesbian, right? So the context really is important. And I'm not going to say it in a derogatory way. I think if you're going to say it, it's like I said about being a woman or being Black, right? Of course you can say I'm Black. But if you're going to say it in a derogatory way, then close your mouth. Don't say it, right? So
I put the slide up that is on inclusive language because when we talk about terminology, sometimes this is where people get uncomfortable or get hung up because if I can't find or say the safe word, the politically correct word, I mean by safe, I'm just not going to say anything.
right.
Because the question does come up a lot. What you just said, is it okay? Do I have to say Black, African American? Which one is right? And the thing here, the real answer is there is no right. And
Exactly.
what if, so humor me, Stacey, what if you prefer to be called African American, but I call you Black? What's your response to that? How might somebody, I just want to give an example of what that means.
Normally I don't have a response, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? The person isn't trying to be harmful or rude or anything. They're just trying to make a guess. Now, my thing is, does it matter to the conversation? Like, why do you care? Right. So that's the first part is why does it matter? Because sometimes it really doesn't. And we're saying these things and it's like, but do you really need to know? Like, what is it? What's the importance of it? Right. But the other part of that is just ask. I have no problem. Just ask me, well, how would you prefer to be labeled? Right. And I'll tell you, I prefer to use Black because you saw my introduction in the beginning, right? I've got a whole mutt mix of things that go on.
A mutt mix. Well, and I think that's the key. So when it comes to inclusive language, a couple of other things people can do is to listen to how other people refer to themselves, listen to the language, the words that they use. That's a really good indicator of the language that they're comfortable with. And then when you're talking about some of these labels, especially when we talk about gender, just use someone's name. You shouldn't need to, or pronouns. Let's put that slide up here because pronouns gets a lot of talk, especially in Pride Month when we talk a lot about gender, gender identity, gender expression, gender, the language of gender. People don't even know what pronouns to use. And the quick answer is just use the name.
Yes. Well, and somebody mentioned that the English is not their first language and want to know what's the advice? How do they get around these sensitive topics? And again, just ask. As long as you are like, we can tell when somebody is being genuine, right?
Most of the time.
For the most part, right? If you're faking it, that's fine, whatever, right? But for the most part, we can tell. Even if you're faking it, I'd prefer that, right? Like over you not being respectful. Right. So if you have a genuine inquiry, people want to help you, right? They want to provide you with the answer. And you can ask. It's okay to say, like if I use the word queer, I might ask somebody, is it okay if I use that word? Does that bother you? Would you prefer I use something else?
Yeah.
Right. And you just ask and they'll tell you, yeah, or no, or whatever it is, right? Or I don't care. So I think we really have to get back to like everything for me really comes back to having the conversations. We've got to be comfortable opening our mouths and letting the words come out.
Using all of our words.
Right. But being clear that I'm asking because I actually want to be educated and I want to respect you. I'm not asking because I'm a jerk. Right.
So there's an interesting comment that came in here. I'm going to hold off on that for a moment because I do want to put this intersectionality slide up because I meant to do it earlier when we were talking about layers and labels and all of that word cloud. The thing about all of us is that we are so many of all of these things. There are lots of different elements about us. Most is invisible. Most of the pieces that are meaningful to our identity are invisible. Some of them are visible. Like if race is a very meaningful part of my identity, you can see that. For some people, it's not. But recognizing that we are, what did you say? We're layers? we have layers. I was trying to come up with something funny to say, like we're 7-layer cakes or something, but we are hundreds of layers, right? We're complicated.
Absolutely. And I always like, I do a lot of work. You mentioned in the beginning, right? One of my courses on LinkedIn was the most popular course on LinkedIn across all their platforms, can I just say, right? So when you think about that, I bring it up because, not to pat myself on the back and go, you're so great, but,
Great.
but to get you to understand that you're talking about LinkedIn, where their courses are on all the Microsoft courses, Excel, right? How to use, all their different Microsoft programs, how to use Java, how to code, how to like all these things. And what was on top of all of that was unconscious bias. Why? Because everybody was struggling with this and really trying to figure out what words do we use? How do we do this? What do we say? And so I think it really is important that we recognize most people actually want to be decent people, right? Most people don't wake up in the morning and say, today I am going to be a sexist jerk, right?
Right.
That's not what people do. Most people wake up and say, I want to be part of the solution. I don't actually know what to do. So I'm just going to do nothing. And so my goal really is to help you get over that hump. Because once you get over that feeling of discomfort, where it's, I know I'm going to say something and it might not be the right thing. Once you can get over that, it's going to make it so much easier for you to be part of the solution, right? To be able to have these conversations. And I think there's freedom in that.
The sentence, everybody write that one down, because that opening, I'll tell you which one. You said, I'm going to say something right now and it might not be the right thing. Like, you can start with that and then say actually what's on your mind.
Right.
You could say, I've heard people suggest the phrase, something to the effect of, I want to say something, I'm not sure how to say it, and I don't want to offend. So I'm going to put it out there. Could you help me understand how I could say it better and understand why this might be offensive? And then when you get that permission, you can say it as directly and as bluntly as you need to say it, just to get the words out.
Right.
And then now we can have that conversation. I can become educated about the words.
Yes. And I think the other part of this is, you really make me realize a really good point, is that it is also about building relationships. Mm-hmm. So for me, the conversation is important. If you are, we've actually started a campaign called the 100K Conversations, because we're trying to get 100,000 people to have conversations. So literally, if you go to 100kconversations.com, you can commit to having a conversation, and you can get all these free resources to help you to have those conversations. Because the thing is, it's not about just having the conversation. It's about building a relationship first. Mm-hmm. Because I don't want to have a conversation with a random person that I don't know. But Fair. If we can get to know each other a little bit first, then I'm going to be comfortable saying, yeah, you know what, Gina, this isn't really, I wouldn't expect you to say that, or I'm not sure why you said that, or you hurt my feelings when you said that. Yeah. But if we don't have any kind of relationship, I'm going to be honest, it's not even worth my time to go into it. I'm just going to write you off as an ignorant racist and walk away, right? Yeah. And that's not what we want to do. So before we get to that point of let's have a conversation, it's like, let's build a relationship. Because many of you are in workplaces where you don't really know your coworkers. And we talk about labels. I always tell people, coworker is a label.
Yes.
It is not a relationship status. So just because we sit next to each other or happen to be on the same floor doesn't mean I know diddly squat about you, or that I care about you in any way, or that I'm going to have your back in a meeting, or that I'm going to be honest with you when you ask me for my opinion, right? None of that's going to happen without some kind of a relationship.
I have never thought of it that way. Coworker is not a relationship. I think what's important there is also boss and manager and leader. Those are roles, not relationships. And I think I never really thought about that, about positioning it that way, because I think people think the label manager prescribes a relationship onto you with me.
Right.
And with that comes responsibilities, but also some rights and privileges. And in this space, it might make it harder if I am your manager, Stacey, for you to feel more comfortable talking with me. You might be afraid to use certain words or feel pressure to use certain words. So that even makes this more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are the kinds of conversations I absolutely love to have. So I'm always like, that's why we started the campaign, because we need more people to talk about it. Because last month I was talking about the what do you call it? Oh my goodness, censorship.
Mm.
And there's a lot of censorship that's happening, especially in the DEI space and in schools. And when you censor, you are now getting to a place where you are taking away the ability to educate. You're taking away the ability for people to commune, to brainstorm, to be productive. Like, censorship kills innovation.
Yeah.
And so it is so important that we continue the conversations. And that's part of what got me started thinking about this, was like, no, we are not going to allow censorship to rule. We actually need to convene, commune, converse, because that is what's going to help us. And so we can't let these labels get in the way of stopping us. Like, I'm not going to talk to you because you're queer and I'm not. I'm not going to talk to you because I don't understand your pronouns, right? I'm not going to talk to you because you're Jewish and I'm Muslim. We have to get past those labels. And the only way we're going to do that is by getting to know people a little bit more. And then we can have some of these,
Right.
more deeper conversations around these topics.
Right. Thank you. That's just so fantastic. I'm putting this up here so we remember, people, participants, everyone, drop some questions for us in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I had a thought, and I thought it was a good thought, and now it's gone. Oh, I want that thought to come back. Hopefully it will. Hopefully it'll pop back in my head. So I want to look back here and read something that came in.
Jina, is it okay if I pop in here with the third poll?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
About intersectionality, and then I'll give it right back to you. I'm just want to make sure we get that in. Thank you for letting me interrupt.
Sure. Thank you for reminding me. I meant to bring it up when we were talking about it earlier. So while that poll is open, Stacey, I'll read this through, and then maybe if you want to talk to it or we'll have some thoughts.
You want to put the poll up?
Isn't the poll live now?
Yes, it's live now. Mm-hmm.
It's live. I didn't put the slide up there.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's there. So in my opinion, the more we want to know who we are, the more we will get confused. If we're comfortable of who we are, a human being with integrity and self-respect, we'll be happy with who we are. When I grew up, my parents taught us everyone is good in their own way and I should be respected. And now I see a lot of parents don't teach their children that value and worry too much about what other people might think. Self-confidence first is nourished and given by parents, and then the kids will develop it along their way. And society is worried too much about correctness, and it will cause people to have anxiety. So there's a lot there. It's really about feeling confident. Some of that confidence comes with our upbringing and culture. And then, is there a concern for you that in all of this work, we're starting to bring up all of this language, label and identify people into groups? Is that eroding that?
Is it eroding
this confidence, creating and making anxiety worse? Because the data is there that says we are more anxious than ever.
I think we're more anxious than ever because we weren't talking about it before, right? Mm-hmm. So it reminds me, and I hate to use this example, but I'm going to use it anyway. I've mentioned I have kids. They're older now, but when they were younger, I sent my two youngest, they were like 8 and 9, to the park because I could literally see them from my balcony, right? I lived across the street from the park. My mom called me and she goes, "Where are my grandchildren?" And I was like, "Oh, they're at the park." She goes, "Why aren't you with them?" And I said, "Because I can see them from my balcony." She was so upset with me. She started going off about pedophiles, right? And I said, "Mom," I said, "the fact that we have a registry and all these things now, and we can log on and see where pedophiles are, doesn't change the fact. I was like, there aren't more of them now. I said, it's just that we can identify them.
Yeah.
Before, we couldn't identify them. And so it makes us anxious because now we can see it, because ignorance is bliss, right?
To a degree, yes.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, that's so, and it's the same thing now. We are now talking about DEI more. We're talking about labels more. It doesn't mean anything has changed for us at all, but it's going to bring our anxiety levels up because it's at the forefront. So we are thinking about it, and we should be thinking about it. You should be anxious about it, because you know what? Out here, life is not great for a lot of people, and we should be thinking about how to fix it. It should make you anxious that there are people who are being murdered because of the color of their skin, or because who they pray to, right? Or because who they are attracted to. That absolutely should make you anxious. And so that is why we're in this place, because now we're talking about it rather than just sweeping it under the rug. Because before, that's what happened with George Floyd, right? And that murder. Before it's not as if people weren't being murdered by the police before. They absolutely were, but we weren't talking about it.
Right.
We weren't noticing it. We just let it go. It happened in 2020, and then people said, "Oh, what is happening?" Right.
And some of this is, we are becoming more mature, more nuanced, more complicated, and more diverse as a society. And this diversity, look at the demographic trends. I mean, if you look at the demographics in the 2020 census versus the 2010 census, it's markedly different. And this is we're going to continue to become more diverse. So knowing all of the language and the terminology, knowing the labels, the positive and the negative and the stereotypes and just descriptives is going to be important. Now, I did remember Gail put a comment here that said, I have found brainstorming with individuals with varying labels can create some very innovative solutions. Thank you, Gail. And the reason is I wanted to go back to a data point, because you said data. There is data, and I wish I had it ready already, but there is data that talks about and validates that when there are more different people of different types, particularly ethnic diversity and gender diversity, we have better decisions. And when you have a homogenous group making decisions for another group, those decisions tend to be less effective and less impactful. Or like, for example, a leadership group makes a decision on what a team will do without input from the team's performance will be what's the word?
Ineffective.
Will be ineffective. Thank you. So the fact that we have to have this diversity in order to be better is data proven. I said that very poorly, but you know what I'm saying. All right, let's see. What else is coming in? Do you see anything in the Q&A? Because I know.
Third poll, we didn't do the results.
Oh, yeah, we didn't. So what are the results? Let's see.
There are questions that have continued to come in, but the results of that poll, how familiar are you with the concept of intersectionality? It looks like the largest proportion said unfamiliar. That was about 40%. About 30% say not very. About an even split between somewhat and those who prefer to stay silent on the issue. And then 6% are very familiar. And I'll go ahead and give it back to you.
All right. So some of the questions have come in. So mostly not familiar.
Right.
Less familiar.
Yes. I would we're getting towards the end here, and I always like to give people homework. So
yeah, okay.
I would do a little research on Kimberly Crenshaw, since she is the person that coined the phrase intersectionality. And you will find a ton of content. I would read the content specifically from her, or a summary of it, because she really explains it pretty well. And I think that it is a concept that it kind of helps. Like, I was just on a session prior to this where we were talking, and one of the questions somebody asked me was, how do you foster inclusion when everybody has so much difference? And it was actually interesting because he used the word queer too. He said, it's like, if you ask somebody, what does it mean to be queer? Everybody in the room might be queer, but every single one of those people is going to be different. And so how do you foster that inclusion among all these individuals? And so it's just a reminder that labels are there to help provide context, but they're not there for you to then decide how to treat a person.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Thank you. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. All right. I want to look and see, because I know there are some things that are coming in, and I don't know that I'm looking in the right place always.
It should be under the priority tab.
Okay.
And while we're doing that, do you want me to go ahead and launch that final poll?
Yeah,
Or
you can launch the poll. That way people
Yeah.
have an opportunity if they haven't hit all of them. We
Yeah.
don't need to see the results on that, but this gives
Sure.
everybody their CPE opportunities. Um,
Yes, I'm looking. I think we've sort of addressed some of these, I hope. As I'm looking at some of the questions, we addressed the one about English not being the first language. Definitely understand that. Andrea says, I would use queer for gender queer than sexual orientation. I mean, again, right, it just depends. And I think there are some resources. I know we put up the slide with the gender expression. I always send people to the genderbread person. So if you Google just genderbread, that will pop up. That's a really good resource to utilize that will help just in understanding some of the differences between attraction, expression, orientation, etc. So
I put the gender unicorn up here because you brought that up. Gender unicorn, genderbread person. Those are two different. There's another one. I don't remember the name. They're cartoon illustrations to understand these differences. Somebody asked to define gender identity. So that's the other reason why I wanted to put this up here. Because identity is how you see yourself versus expression, which is how you show up for others. So I thought of that earlier, Stacey, because you talked about I could be an uncle. And you could be an uncle because your gender identity, you might see yourself and express yourself as a male, even if anatomically you are biologically female. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, it definitely is.
Well, before we wrap up, Stacey, I'm going to toss it to you for some final thoughts. But before we do, I want to remind everybody, this is a monthly webinar series. And so coming up in 4 weeks, it's now the fourth Friday of the month, Rika, I hope I say her name right. I was trying. Rika Salonen. She is a managing director at BCT Partners, and she's going to be joining us to talk about allyship and looking at, I think it's inspired by the Better Allies book. I don't remember the name of the author, but there are different types of allies. So what type of ally are you, and what do these different archetypes of allyship offer in terms of support, mentorship, championship, and etc. For others? And so please join us. The registration isn't open yet, but hopefully it will be open soon. And with that, Stacey, any final thoughts you want to share with everyone?
Yeah, I know I had that slide where with the quote, right, which I think is, I love this quote, just what you were doing speaks so loudly, I cannot hear what you were saying. And sometimes we really have to think, we talk a lot, right? We say a lot of things. And we say, oh, I'm not a racist, I'm not a homophobe, I'm not sexist, but your actions, right, sometimes speak for you. And we have to really think about what it is that our actions might be saying when our words are saying something else. So I like to leave people with that quote to just, rather than talk about what you're doing, we need to sort of be about it.
I love that. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
All right, Jasmine, back to you to close us out.